Imagine a crowded lecture hall in Cambridge during the late 20th century. The air is thick with anticipation, the kind reserved for rock stars or revolutionaries. A celebrated figure steps to the podium, promising to finally solve a riddle that has plagued thinkers for 100 years. The ancient war between human freedom and social cages. He doesn't bring data. He doesn't bring historical case studies. He brings a new vocabulary. He speaks with a hypnotic rhythm, weaving words like recursivity, duality, and instantiation into a complex web. He draws a diagram where arrows loop back on themselves endlessly. The audience is mesmerized. To them, it feels like a peace treaty has finally been signed between the individual and the state. It feels like the heavy, static blocks of sociology have suddenly liquefied into a dynamic river. Everyone leaves the room feeling smarter, convinced they've just witnessed the architecture of modern life. But then the dust settles. You go home, look at your notes, and try to apply this breakthrough to the real world, to a strike, a revolution, or even just a shifting economy. And suddenly, the elegant machine freezes. You realize that those looping arrows didn't actually go anywhere. They just circled. What looked like a journey into the deep structure of reality was, upon closer inspection, just a very sophisticated, very expensive way of running in place. This is the story of how sociology fell in love with the ghosts. That opening really, it sets the stage perfectly for what we're trying to do today. We were taking a deep dive into one of the most, I think, ambitious intellectual projects of the 20th century.
Absolutely. It was a systematic attempt to just rebuild social theory from the ground up.
Right. And it was driven by this need to find a path between two extremes. On one hand, you had the rigid determinism of historical materialism.
And on the other, you wanted to avoid the traps of what's called static functionalism. This project was all about finding that middle way.
And it gave us this whole new language, this new vocabulary to describe social reality.
It did, but a language that came with a huge amount of controversy. I mean, that's why we have to get into it. We need to dissect these often very abstract words, recursivity, duality, time-space distanciation.
And we also have to understand the critique of Marx that really started this whole thing off.
Yes, and then we have to face that central paradox. Why a theory that was so intellectually elegant was later criticized for, well, not being very useful for researchers in the field.
Okay, so let's strip away all the jargon for a second. At its heart, what is the fundamental problem, the ancient conflict, this theory is really trying to solve for us?
It's the classic sociological riddle, really. How do you reconcile human agency? I mean, our ability to act, to choose, to innovate with social structure.
The rules, the norms, the institutions that box us in.
Exactly. The inescapable constraints. Are we just puppets of these big historical forces, or are we totally free subjects who can just, create reality with our choices?
And this theory, structuration theory, says the answer is neither.
It rejects both extremes. It's trying to replace those heavy static models with something dynamic, something that shows structure and agency aren't enemies at war. They're actually inseparable. They co-create social reality constantly.
So to build this new engine, you first have to dismantle the old one. And for critical social theory at the time, the dominant model was, it was the traditional Marxist evolutionary scheme.
Right. That's the primary target.
Let's start there. The idea that society evolves on this kind of linear path based on how we survive, how we produce things. What was the core problem that was identified with that view, especially the one from works like the German ideology?
The critique really zeroes in on that strict, almost mechanical evolutionary scheme. The one that links all of societal development directly to how the division of labor progresses and how property forms change.
The assumption of economic primacy.
Exactly. The claim that the organization of production is somehow more fundamental than anything else, more than politics, religion, kinship, you name it, in explaining why a society sticks around or why it changes. That claim is called clearly invalid if you just take it at face value as a universal law.
And what about Marx's starting point? The idea that human life just rests on production.
Well, that's dismissed as a tautology.
Meaning it's true, but it doesn't really tell you anything.
Precisely. Of course, human life rests on production. We have to eat to live. But just saying that, it does absolutely nothing to explain the incredible variety of human societies, of institutional forms, or why history changes in the way it does. It doesn't have any explanatory power on its own.
Okay, so if that kind of economic determinism is out, what does this new theory put at the very center of social life? If it's not labor, what is it?
The replacement is the concept of praxis.
Praxis.
If economic determinism is too narrow, praxis, which is just defined as human social activity, becomes the foundational term. It's meant to be an ontological term, expressing a basic trait of being human. That we are always active, always engaged, always doing something that is both knowledgeable and, at the same time, constrained.
I like the focus on activity, but how does just shifting the term to praxis actually help solve that structure versus agency riddle?
It's a subtle but crucial shift. It moves you away from thinking of humans as just passive objects, being swept along by historical forces.
Or on the other side, as these completely free minds who aren't affected by anything.
Right. Praxis puts the emphasis on the fact that human action is always carried out by knowledgeable agents. We are constrained, yes, by social rules, but, and this is the key, we're also the very people who construct and then continually reconstruct those rules through our everyday actions. The moment we act, we're both using the structure and remaking it. It's a double-sided process.
Let's get to the engine of change then. The famous Marxist idea is that the forces of production, our technology, our tools, eventually outgrow the relations of production, like property ownership. That clash creates a contradiction that triggers a revolution. Why is that specific dialectic rejected as a universal law of history?
It's rejected because, the argument goes, it's not some miraculous device that explains change across all of human history. Instead, it's seen as having a peculiar reference to capitalism.
So it works for capitalism, but you can't just apply it everywhere else.
Exactly. The critique suggests that, yes, this dialectic is a powerful way to describe the internal tensions within capitalism, where you have this constant drive for new technology clashing with private property, but it fails when you try to universalize it.
And what's the evidence for that failure?
The evidence is actually found by going back and looking at some of Marx's own later, less published writings, specifically the Foreman from the Grundriss. In those notes, Marx really dug into pre-capitalist societies, and the structuration critique argues that the Foreman basically shows that in those societies, production was often secondary. It was subordinated to social relations that already existed.
Subordinated to things like community identity or kinship rules or even just your relationship with nature.
Yes. That's a huge distinction. If production is subordinated to the community, it means the forces of production don't have some kind of unstoppable internal dynamic of their own.
The growth of farming tools didn't just automatically cause a revolution.
Exactly. In those contexts, the things that drove big transformations were often external or non-economic. Things like warfare, conquest, contact between different societies, or what they call ecological factors.
Like populations moving into new areas.
Right, the dispersal or concentration of people. Economic development was dependent on these social and political factors. It wasn't the engine driving everything else.
This attack on the evolutionary model seems to hit hardest when it comes to how Marx dealt with non-Western societies. The source material is very clear that the term Asiatic mode of production should just be dropped completely. Why is that classification seen as so deeply flawed and, well, Eurocentric?
There are really three major flaws, and they all work together to undermine that whole universal claim of the forces-relations dialectic.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, Marx really struggled to explain how you could have a huge, centralized state-like in ancient India or China without what he considered to be clear, identifiable economic classes in open conflict.
Which goes against his whole theory of the state.
It goes directly against his foundational thesis that the state is just the medium of class domination. If the Asiatic mode didn't have private property and class struggle as he defined them, then who or what was the state dominating? It's a fundamental contradiction in his own application of the theory.
And the second difficulty?
The second is empirical. Marx described these societies as stagnant, showing a peculiar unchangeability. He basically saw them as historical dead ends because they didn't develop along the same path that led to European feudalism and then capitalism.
But that wasn't true.
Not at all. Empirically, places like ancient China or the various Indian kingdoms were incredibly dynamic systems. They had codified law, advanced science, cultural innovation, centuries of states forming and collapsing. They were anything but static.
And the third flaw was about property.
Yes. Marx really overemphasized the idea of these self-contained little villages and claimed there was no private property, that the state just owned everything. But the historical evidence shows that's not the case. Private property in various forms was widespread across pretty much all agrarian states, including the ones Marx called Asiatic.
So the very measuring stick he was using, the development of economic forces, was the problem itself. If a society didn't follow the European path, it was just labeled as stuck.
Precisely. Which leads to the conclusion that the whole evolutionary scheme is marked by these Eurocentric overtones. The judgment of Asian societies as stagnant is a direct result of judging them by an index that was created from the Western experience.
So what's the alternative?
The critique insists that any real analysis of society has to acknowledge world time and the influence of intersocietal systems. Global connections, not just internal development, shape history. You have to throw out linear evolutionism and stop searching for these abstract universal laws that are supposed to apply everywhere, regardless of context.
Okay, so we've established what this theory is against. This idea of materialist determinism and static evolution. Now we have to turn to what it's for. We're moving into structuration theory itself, a project designed to build a whole new foundation. We heard it was influenced by German and French critical thought. What's the deep philosophical bedrock here?
The philosophical grounding is really important, and it's a big shift away from, say, Newtonian physics or Kantian philosophy. The theory rejects the idea that time and space are just these passive external containers that social life gets poured into.
So instead of time being a box we exist inside, it's something we're constantly making with our actions. Can you give us a more conversational take on the Heidegger influence here?
That is a perfect way to put it. Heidegger rethinks time-space as presencing. You can think of it as this constant active process, a continual intermingling of what's right here, present, and what is absent but still influencing us.
Okay.
For humans, our very being is inseparable from time. We're always projecting ourselves into the future while being shaped by the past. So the social world isn't located in time-space, it's constituted by it.
So social relationships themselves are defined by how they bridge that gap between presence and absence, how they connect what's here and now with what's far away in time or space.
Absolutely. And what's really fascinating is how this connects back to Marx, actually. Even though the theory is critiquing his economic primacy, it sees a strong link between this relational view of time-space and Marx's own analysis of labor time in Capitalism.
Right. Capitalism is, at its core, a massive reorganization of how we experience and measure time.
Yes. So this philosophical foundation makes the later analysis of power in capitalism much, much stronger.
And this foundation leads us straight to the core concept, the big breakthrough at the heart of the theory, the duality of structure. This is supposed to be the peace treaty between structure and agency. What does that phrase actually mean? How does society reproduce itself?
The duality of structure is the fundamental mechanism. It just means that the structured properties of social systems are, at the same time, both the medium and the outcome of social acts.
Medium and outcome.
It's a loop. It's constantly generating social stability through our actions. Every time you act, you're using the structure, the rules to guide your action. And by doing that, you are simultaneously reinforcing the existence of those very rules.
Okay, to get this, we need the definition straight. You mentioned social systems and social structures. What's the difference between them?
This distinction is absolutely crucial, and it's where this idea of virtual existence comes in. Social systems are the things you can actually see. The situated practices, the patterns of relationships, a wedding, a factory assembly line, a protest. They're concrete.
And structures.
Structures, on the other hand, only have a virtual existence. They are the underlying abstract sets of rules and resources that are used in the practices that reproduce the system across time and space.
Wait, hold on. If structure is only virtual, if it's just rules and resources, how do we even find it as researchers? Are we just measuring its effects, the system? I mean, doesn't that risk making the whole thing an unprovable metaphysical claim? Which is what some critics said later.
That is the exact challenge. The theory deals with it by saying that structure exists as memory traces. It exists in the knowledgeable capacity of the human agent, in what we know how to do, the rules we know how to follow. You infer the virtual structure by observing the pattern of the system that it makes possible.
An analogy might help here.
The linguistic analogy is the best way in. Think about language. The rules of syntax, grammar, vocabulary. That's the structure. It's the virtual knowledge you have in your mind.
Okay.
When you draw on those rules as the medium to speak a sentence, that's the social act. The sentence you actually say is the outcome. But in the very act of speaking, you reinforce your own knowledge of the grammar, and so you reproduce the structure for the next time you speak.
So the structure makes the conversation possible, and the conversation keeps the structure alive. A continuous loop.
A continuous recursive loop. That's the duality of structure.
That makes a lot more sense. It feels inherently dynamic, which was the goal. What specific flaw from older sociological models, like functionalism, does this concept help avoid?
It's explicitly designed to avoid the biggest error of functionalism, which is focusing on so-called system needs and creating a false split between statics or synchronic analysis and dynamics, diachronic analysis.
System needs.
Yeah, functionalists often talk about society like it's an organism with needs, a need for stability, a need for integration. This theory says, no, systems have no needs in that sense. There's nothing that really counts as a functionalist explanation. By grounding everything in knowledgeable human agents using virtual rules and resources, the framework gets rid of the whole idea of function while still letting you analyze how social forms are reproduced over time.
Okay, so let's scale up. We've got the microengine of reproduction, the duality of structure. How does that engine project power across huge distances, across centuries? That seems to require rethinking space and time on a massive scale. And that's where time-space distanciation, or TSD, comes in.
Right. TSD is basically the metric for how integrated a social system is, how far it can stretch, how much it can dissolve the limits of time and space. Every social system has some form of TSD, but the scale of it varies dramatically throughout history, and that helps us categorize different types of societies.
Let's start with low TSD societies. How did social life and power work in, say, a traditional pre-modern society?
Societies with low TSD are defined by high presence availability.
Meaning most of your interactions are with people who are physically there.
Exactly, or at least known to you locally. Time is also deeply qualitative. It's not abstract hours and minutes. It's tied to the substance of what you're doing. Harvest time, planting time, the time for a religious festival. Daily life is geared to tradition.
So human memory is basically the hard drive.
Precisely. Human memory passed down through tradition, myth, stories. It's the main storage container that organizes time and space. Power is localized. It's tied to immediate context because mediating things across great distances is really difficult and slow.
And capitalism, then, represents the big shift to high TSD. How does that structurally change how power works?
Capitalism kicks off this massive dissolution of time-space constraints. Social practices get lifted out of the local contexts. The classic example is the shift from the city to the nation-state.
The power container.
Right. In earlier civilizations, the city was the main power container. Under high TSD, the nation-state takes over, and it can integrate social relations, economic, political, cultural, across vast geographical areas using things like mass literacy, standardized transport, and eventually electronic communication.
And this idea of TSD is directly tied to how power is generated. The theory says power comes from the intersection of two types of resources embedded in the structure, allocative and authoritative. It seems like a really critical distinction.
It's fundamental, and it's the theory's alternative to a purely economic definition of power. They're an analytical distinction, but they map onto reality very clearly.
So define them for us.
Okay, allocative resources are about control over the material world. Control over nature, raw materials, land, capital, surplus production. Think of it as pure economic leverage.
Got it. And authoritative.
Authoritative resources are about control over human action and social organization. This includes things like organizing social time-space, like scheduling when and where labor happens, control over the human body, and organizing life chances, like who gets access to education or opportunities.
So money is allocative, but the ability to tell people where to be and when is authoritative.
Exactly. Laws and bureaucracy are authoritative. Oil and grain are allocative.
Now here's what's fascinating. The argument about storage capacity. The theory says that the extension of power is linked to the ability to store these resources. But which type of storage is considered more significant for the creation of early states and civilizations?
This is a bit counterintuitive, but the theory argues that the storage of authoritative resources is often more significant in the beginning of state power than the storage of allocative resources, like a surplus of grain.
I'm not sure I follow that. I mean, if you don't have enough grain, the allocative surplus, your civilization starves. Why would authoritative storage matter more?
Because forming a state is fundamentally about controlling populations and territory, not just stuff. And the killer app for authoritative storage was the invention of writing and notation.
Information.
And information. Writing allowed the state to store and analyze huge amounts of data needed for large-scale administration, for taxation, for surveillance. Literacy and written records let you project centralized power across space. It detaches command from the immediate presence of the king or the emperor.
So the state apparatus, the information management, had to come first.
In many cases, yes. While storing grain is obviously necessary, if you look at early civilizations like Mesopotamia or Pharaonic Egypt, you see that political and military control authoritative resources were paramount. They controlled the land and the people, which then allowed them to systematically extract the material surplus. The authoritative foundation had to be there to effectively control the allocation of material resources.
Let's apply this directly to the great historical rupture that is capitalism. If time and space are totally reorganized, how does the theory explain a phrase we all use, time is money, on a structural level?
Capitalism basically forces time into what's called a double existence. On one hand, you still have time as your subjective lived experience, the durée of being, the flow of your day.
Right.
But capitalism introduces a second parallel existence, time as a separate quantitative dimension. This is measured duration, and it's freely exchangeable, universal, and quantified, just like money.
It strips time of its qualitative meaning. It's not harvest time anymore, it's just 3 hours.
Exactly. And the theory argues that the key material carrier of this whole process is not the steam engine, not the printing press, but the public, objectified time of the clock.
The clock is the physical expression of commodified time.
Absolutely. The need for standardized, precise time, which the clock makes possible, is the very expression of the commodification of time. The clock is essential for coordinating machinery, sure, but more importantly, it's essential for the standardized measurement and coordination of labor power.
You can't run a factory without it.
You can't have labor discipline without the clock telling you when to start, when to stop, and how fast you have to work. It coordinates the machines and the humans together.
This concentration of workers, managed by the clock, brings us to the factory system and new forms of control. How is capitalist labor control really different from what you saw in, say, serfdom or slavery?
The key difference is that the capitalist employer is dealing with free wage labor. They can't just use physical force or rely on old traditions of moral obligation. The real sanction is purely economic.
The need to sell your labor to survive.
Yes, what Marx called der stumme Zwang, the dull compulsion of economic necessity.
And the factory itself.
The factory system spread primarily because putting all the workers in one place allowed for the surveillance of labor. That surveillance was the substitute for direct force. It let the employer control the process of labor, the speed, the discipline, the workflow, in a way that was impossible when work was scattered in homes or in small artisanal shops.
This focus on surveillance sounds very much like the work of Foucault, especially his analysis of the prison. Does this theory just absorb Foucault's ideas, or is there a critical difference?
There's a very important critical difference, and it comes back to the idea of the knowledgeable agent. While surveillance is obviously crucial, the theory criticizes Foucault's work for drawing too close a line between the factory and the prison, or what are called total institutions.
Why isn't the factory a total institution?
Because the worker is free wage labor. Total institutions, like a prison or an asylum, are designed to radically strip away an individual's autonomy. But the factory worker, no matter how constrained, still has the formal freedom to withhold their labor.
They can quit, they can organize, they can go on strike.
Exactly. And that possibility of resistance fundamentally separates the factory from the panopticon of the prison. The argument is that Foucault's approach can risk creating a history without knowledgeable human subjects. It's great at describing how power makes bodies docile, but it can struggle to explain active resistance.
Whereas this theory always emphasizes.
It emphasizes that the subjects of power are not just passive recipients of discipline. They are knowledgeable agents who are constantly interpreting, resisting, blunting, or even actively changing the power relations that are imposed on them. The so-called docile bodies on the factory floor are the ones who organize unions and demand rights. They are far from passive.
That really reframes the whole dynamic.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the state. You argued there's a fundamental break between the capitalist state and earlier empires. What are the key distinctions?
There are three main structural differences. The most radical one is the reversal of resource primacy. In pre-capitalist societies, like ancient Rome or feudal Europe, power came from authoritative resources, military and political control. That control was then used to command allocative resources, like land and slave labor. The rules came first.
And in capitalism?
In capitalism, the power of the dominant class, the capitalists, comes fundamentally from their control of allocative resources. capital and private property. That economic power is then used to structure society, labor, and the state.
So, structurally speaking, the money controls the rules, not the other way around.
Yeah.
What's the second distinction?
The second is the structural insulation of the economy and the polity. In older systems, the state and the ruling class were often one and the same, directly taking the surplus by force. In the capitalist state, the state doesn't directly own the factories. Its revenue depends on successful capital accumulation happening in the private sector. This structural situation where the state has to protect capital but is institutionally separate from it, that's what gives rise to the idea of the state's relative autonomy. It has to keep society stable, sometimes even against the short-term desires of individual capitalists.
And the third feature is about citizenship rights. They weren't just given, they were won. How did that challenge the traditional story of liberal democracy?
The traditional view often presents citizenship rights, legal, political, social, as either just functional requirements for capitalism or as gifts from a benevolent liberal state.
And this critique says no.
It emphasizes that these rights were won through long, active class struggle by organized labor movements. They fought to make the universal citizen of bourgeois law a reality for working people.
And there was another factor, too.
Yes, the expansion of these rights was heavily influenced by external pressures, especially the two world wars. These massive conflicts intensified the internal class conflicts, and they forced the ruling classes to concede social rights like welfare and unemployment insurance as a way to maintain social order and ensure the loyalty of the working population during a massive crisis.
Okay, we've gone through the elegance of the theory, the structure-agency loop, the redefinition of time and space, the uniqueness of the capitalist state. This is supposed to be the new scaffolding for a dynamic sociology. But let's come back to that ghost from the intro, the idea that the elegant machine was just running in place.
Right.
Why did this theory end up facing accusations of empirical emptiness?
The main critique, really, is that the theory is a brilliant ontology, a complex theory of what society is, but a very weak methodology, a guide for how to actually research it and explain how it changes.
So the vocabulary was sophisticated, but it didn't give researchers the actual tools they needed in the field.
That's the knock against it, yes. Terms like duality, recursivity, instantiation. They're powerful for describing things, but they also fail to translate into testable hypotheses or concrete research plans. If you wanted to study, say, the decay of an institution, structuration theory didn't just hand you a simple causal model or a set of variables to measure.
Because it insists that structure and agency are this inseparable, constant loop.
Right. And in doing that, it sometimes made the task of isolating specific causes incredibly complex, which led to these accusations of obscurity.
So by solving the riddle, by making them inseparable, it made it almost impossible to say whether structure caused agency or vice versa in any specific situation.
That's the trade-off, precisely. It achieved this incredible philosophical elegance by getting beyond the dualism, but it sacrificed methodological simplicity. It didn't want to provide simple causal relationships, which meant it was often silent on the where and when questions that researchers really need to answer. Even the theorist himself later admitted how messy and complex it was to apply the theory strictly.
Now, for what might be the greatest irony of all, this highly critical philosophical project designed to neutralize deterministic Marxism had this very strange afterlife outside of critical sociology. It somehow migrated into management studies and public policy. How on earth did the duality of structure get co-opted by corporations and bureaucrats?
It is a profound paradox. When it was taken up by organizational studies, the theory provided this very sophisticated language for analyzing things like organizational culture or networks between firms or decision-making. Management consultants loved it.
How did they use it specifically?
They latched onto the idea that structure exists as rules and resources that are continually reproduced by knowledgeable agents who, in this case, are the managers and the workers.
Okay, give me an example.
So imagine a big company has a really entrenched, inefficient way of approving budgets. The consultant can come in and use the theory to explain, well, this system, the inefficient process, is reproduced every day because the managers, the knowledgeable agents, draw upon the existing rules, the structure, to do their jobs. And in doing so, they validate and strengthen those very rules.
I could see the danger immediately. Instead of using it to find the deep contradictions that would force change, you're just using it to describe why things stay the same.
You've hit it exactly. The focus becomes entirely on the reproduction of the existing pattern, the situated practices, without offering any kind of transformative critique. By centering attention on how existing rules are constantly reaffirmed, the elegant language of the duality of structure accidentally became a very sophisticated tool for justifying bureaucratic inertia. It gave an intellectual reason for why big organizations don't change. It became a theory of stability, not transformation.
Which brings us full circle, back to the engine of change: contradiction. If the theory was designed to analyze these deep structural faults, how does it make sure they actually lead to change instead of just reinforcing the status quo?
This goes back to a crucial analytical distinction the theory makes: the need to separate contradiction from conflict.
Is that just academic hair splitting? I mean, does it really matter if we call a strike a conflict that's caused by a structural gap or just a fight over wages?
It matters enormously because it tells you where the potential for fundamental change actually lies. Conflict is the thing you can see: the strike, the political battle, the argument. Contradiction, on the other hand, is the structural fault line. It's the latent, deep-seated opposition that's built into the very constitution of the system. So for capitalism, the main structural principle is accumulation through private appropriation. But that can only work through a contrary principle, which is overall societal reproduction, which requires some kind of control of resources by the community as a whole. That deep, constant structural gap between private appropriation and socialized production, that's what provides the latent fault lines.
So the contradiction provides the underlying tension.
Yes, the systemic instability. Conflict is just what breaks out along those fault lines. The contradiction is the condition that makes a widespread conflict, like a major class struggle or a political crisis, possible, even if the conflict itself is triggered by something small, like a single policy change. By keeping that distinction, the theory ensures that, despite the recursive loop, the system always contains instabilities that prevent it from ever achieving total, eternal stability.
That structural fault line is the reason the elegant machine can never run perfectly smoothly.
Precisely. To kind of sum up the whole journey, we moved away from Marx's economic determinism to a view centered on praxis, on the knowledgeable human agent, and the fundamental dual nature of structure, all grounded in a relational theory of time and space.
And in doing that, the framework really did achieve its biggest goal: identifying the profound uniqueness of capitalism. It's defined by the commodification of time, that shift in power from authoritative to allocative resources, and the institutional separation of the economy and the state. It sees capitalism as a genuine historical rupture, not just the next step on an evolutionary ladder.
And its lasting legacy, I think, is its insistence that we have to look past static systems and past simple dualisms and understand society as something that is constantly being made and remade. It highlights that social life is the continuous outcome of knowledgeable agents who draw upon, and in doing so reproduce, the very rules and resources that also constrain them. The power struggle in modern life is never just about who controls the money or the army. It's fundamentally about who controls the organization of time, the configuration of space, and the distribution of life chances that results from it.